The dawn broke crimson over Port Royal on the 7th day of July, 1712, and the fishermen hauling their nets along the waterfront swore later that the sky bled like a fresh wound. They did not know yet that 3 Spanish merchantmen had burned to the waterline off the Cayman banks during the night. Their crews vanished without trace, their hulls gutted by fire so complete that even the iron fittings melted into the sea. But Captain Nathaniel Cross knew. He stood at the window of his rented room above a chandler's shop, fingers tight around a crumpled letter sealed with red wax, and watched the harbour wake to rumour and fear. The letter bore no signature, only a single crimson thumbprint pressed into the wax, the mark of the Red Captain, a phantom who moved through Caribbean waters like fever through blood, leaving destruction and silence in their wake. Cross had hunted pirates for 11 years under the flag of His Majesty's Navy, had seen men hanged at Execution Dock and watched their bodies swing in chains until the gulls picked them clean. But this enemy remained formless, a story whispered in every port from Havana to Cartagena. If you hunger for tales of the sea's darkest legends, subscribe now and tell us your port of call in the comments below. Cross descended the narrow stairs into the chandler's shop, where the proprietor was arranging coils of hemp rope and blocks of beeswax candles. The air smelled of tar and sawdust. Outside, the street filled with merchants and sailors exchanging news, their voices rising in alarm. Word had reached Port Royal an hour before dawn, carried by a single survivor pulled from a drifting longboat, his hands blistered from rowing, his eyes hollow with whatever he had witnessed. The survivor's name was William Marsh, a gunner's mate aboard the Spanish vessel Santa Clara, and he sat now in the harbour-master's office surrounded by colonial officials and naval officers. Cross pushed through the crowd gathered at the door. Inside, Marsh hunched over a cup of rum, his lips cracked and bleeding, his shirt stiff with salt. He would not look at the men who questioned him. He stared instead at his trembling hands. 3 ships, Marsh whispered. The Santa Clara, the Nuestra Senora, and the San Miguel, all burning at once from the inside. We never saw another vessel. We never heard cannon fire, only screaming, and then silence. The harbour-master, a stout man named Pemberton with ink-stained fingers, leaned forward. You saw no attackers, no flag? I saw shadows, Marsh said. His voice cracked, moving below deck. And I saw the captain's cabin door open, and a figure standing there, tall and still, wearing a coat red as blood. They did not speak. They did not move. And when I looked away and looked back, they were gone. A murmur rippled through the room. Cross felt the weight of old stories pressing against the present. The accumulated dread of 100 portside taverns, where sailors spoke of the Red Captain in voices barely above breath. Some said the Red Captain was a woman, a Portuguese noblewoman turned corsair after her family was massacred by Spanish soldiers. Others claimed the figure was a former Royal Navy officer who had gone mad with fever and now sailed under no flag but vengeance. Still others insisted the Red Captain was no single person at all, but a name shared by a conspiracy of raiders who moved in coordinated strikes, appearing and vanishing like ghosts. Cross knew only that cities burned when the Red Captain came near, that ships vanished in waters thought secure, and that no survivors lived to describe the face beneath the crimson coat. He left the harbour-master's office and walked the waterfront, past the slave market and the rum distilleries, toward the naval yard, where his ship, the Resolution, lay at anchor. His crew was already assembling. 32 men hardened by Caribbean service, armed with flintlock pistols and cutlasses, their faces grim with purpose. His first mate, a scarred Jamaican named Solomon Price, stood at the gangplank. "Orders, Captain?" Price asked. "We sail with the evening tide," Cross said. "Southwest toward the Caymans. Pemberton wants those Spanish wrecks found and examined before they sink entirely, and he wants survivors, if any remain." Price's expression darkened. "The crew's heard the stories, sir. They're saying this is Red Captain's work. They're saying whoever hunts the Red Captain ends up feeding the sharks." "Then we feed the sharks together," Cross said. "Prepare the ship." The Resolution cleared Port Royal harbour as the sun dropped toward the western horizon, painting the waves in shades of copper and rust. Cross stood at the quarterdeck, watching the island recede, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before action. The wind filled the sails, the hull creaked with strain, and the crew moved through their tasks with practiced efficiency, but underneath their discipline, Cross sensed fear, the kind that spread like contagion in close quarters. That night, as the stars emerged and the ship ran southwest through calm seas, Cross heard the men singing below deck, an old shanty about a ghost ship crewed by the drowned, its words half-remembered and mournful. He descended the companion ladder into the gun-room, where Price sat cleaning his pistols by lantern light. "The men are spooked," Price said without looking up. "Half believe the Red Captain commands devils. The other half think we're chasing a phantom invented by Spanish merchants to hide their own incompetence." "And you?" Cross asked. Price set down his pistol and met Cross's gaze. "I think someone's been sinking ships methodically for 2 years, and no one's caught even a glimpse of their face. That takes more than luck, sir. That takes inside knowledge of routes, of schedules, of weaknesses. Someone's feeding them information." Cross had considered this. The Red Captain struck with precision, always targeting the wealthiest cargoes, always choosing moments when naval patrols were elsewhere. The attacks bore the signature of military planning, not random piracy. But who could coordinate such intelligence across Spanish, English, and French colonial waters without detection? The Resolution reached the Cayman Banks at dawn on the 3rd day. The sea here ran shallow and turquoise, treacherous with coral reefs that had claimed countless hulls. Through his spyglass, Cross spotted the wrecks. 3 blackened skeletons jutting from the water like burned ribs. Their masts collapsed, their decks caved inward. No bodies floated in the debris. The water around the wrecks was unnaturally clear, as if even the fish avoided the sight. Cross ordered 2 longboats launched. He descended into the lead boat with Price and 6 armed sailors, and they rowed through the wreckage field. The smell hit first. Not of decay, but of something chemical and sharp, like sulfur mixed with burning pitch. Cross's stomach tightened. They approached the nearest wreck, the remains of the Santa Clara. Her hull had been split open from within, the planks blown outward in a pattern inconsistent with external cannon fire. Cross reached out and touched the charred wood. It crumbled to powder at his fingertips. "Greek fire," Price said quietly, "or something like it. Incendiary mixture placed below deck and ignited all at once." "Nah, but Marsh said they saw no one board," Cross said. "Then someone was already aboard before they set sail." The implication hung between them. A traitor within the crew, or multiple traitors coordinated across 3 vessels. Cross felt the edges of something vast and organized, far beyond the scope of ordinary piracy. He ordered his men to search for survivors or cargo, but found neither. The Spanish ships had carried sugar and silver, according to Port Royal's intelligence, but the holds were empty except for seawater and ash. In the captain's cabin of the Santa Clara, half submerged and listing, Cross found a single object that had survived the flames. A leather-bound logbook, its pages waterlogged but partially legible. He carried it back to the longboat and returned to the Resolution, where he spread the salvaged pages across his cabin table. Most entries were routine: wind speed, compass bearings, the tedious accounting of ship management. But on the final page, written in a different hand, darker ink, Cross read words that made his pulse quicken. The agreement stands. Deliver the cargo to the coordinates marked, or join your brothers at the bottom. The Red Captain keeps accounts. Below this message, someone had sketched a crude map showing a small cay west of Grand Cayman, marked with an X. And beside the X, pressed into the damp page, was a red thumbprint. Cross ordered the Resolution to sail west. The crew obeyed, but their unease grew palpable. Men checked their weapons constantly, looked over their shoulders at empty deck space, whispered prayers to saints they half-remembered from childhood. Cross felt it too, the sensation of being watched, of moving deeper into waters that wanted them gone. They reached the marked quay at midday on the fourth day, a low spit of sand and palm trees barely visible above the waves. Cross took a landing party ashore, pistols primed, cutlasses drawn. The beach bore marks of recent occupation, fire pits, flattened areas where tents had stood, the tracks of heavy crates dragged across sand. But no people, no vessels, only the wind moving through the palms and the cry of seabirds. Price found the cash buried beneath a lightning-struck tree. They dug with their hands and uncovered 3 wooden chests bound with iron, each marked with the seal of the Spanish crown. Cross pried open the first chest. Inside, silver reals, thousands of coins gleaming in the tropical sun. The second chest held bars of refined sugar wrapped in oilcloth. The third contained documents, bills of lading, customs records, correspondence between colonial governors. "This is the Santa Clara's cargo," Cross said, "stolen before the ship burned. Then Marsh lied," Price said, "or didn't know. The cargo was offloaded before the attack, moved here by arrangement." Cross read through the documents, his mind racing. The papers revealed a pattern. Spanish merchants in league with colonial officials, diverting cargo, reporting it as lost to piracy, collecting insurance payments while selling the goods through intermediaries in Port Royal and Bridgetown. The Red Captain was not the architect of this scheme, but the enforcer. The Phantom used to intimidate and eliminate those who broke their agreements. But who commanded the Red Captain? Whose hand guided this network? The answer came that night. As the Resolution lay anchored off the quay, Cross sat in his cabin studying the documents by candlelight when he heard shouting above deck. He grabbed his pistol and climbed the ladder to find his crew assembled at the rail, staring toward the shore. A fire had been lit on the beach, a massive bonfire, its flames reaching high into the darkness. And silhouetted against the flames stood a figure in a long coat, unmoving, watching the ship. Cross felt ice in his veins. "Arm yourselves," he ordered. "Prepare the boats." But before the crew could act, the figure raised one arm, and from the darkness behind the bonfire emerged a dozen longboats, each manned by armed raiders, each rowing toward the Resolution in perfect silence. They moved like a military formation, coordinated and efficient. Cross realized with sick certainty that his ship was surrounded. "Battle stations!" he shouted. "Load the guns!" His crew scrambled to the cannons, but the raiders reached the hull before the first gun could be fired. They climbed the sides with grappling hooks, their faces masked with black cloth, their weapons drawn. The deck erupted into chaos, musket fire, the clash of steel, men shouting and falling. Cross fired his pistol at a masked raider and watched the figure drop. He drew his cutlass and fought hand to hand, parrying and thrusting, his world reduced to survival. Price fought beside him, his blade singing through the air. "Too many, sir. They planned this. They knew we'd be here." Because of course they did. Because Cross had followed the breadcrumb trail exactly as intended, had sailed precisely where the Red Captain wanted him to go. He had been herded like prey into a killing ground. The raiders pushed Cross's crew back toward the mainmast. Bodies lay scattered across the deck, some still moving, some already gone. Cross's shoulder burned where a blade had sliced him, blood soaking his shirt. He prepared to make his last stand when a voice cut through the din, a voice he recognized. "Hold!" The raiders froze. The figure from the beach had boarded the ship and now stood at the quarterdeck railing, removing the mask. Cross stared in disbelief. It was Pemberton, the harbour master from Port Royal, the ink-stained bureaucrat who had questioned William Marsh, who had sent Cross on this hunt. But Pemberton no longer looked soft or clerical. He wore a crimson coat with gold buttons, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had orchestrated death across 1,000 miles of ocean. "Captain Cross," Pemberton said, "you were always too principled for your own good. Did you really think the Crown cared about Spanish merchants? About a few burned ships? This is business, Nathaniel. The Caribbean runs on theft, sanctioned by governors and admirals who take their share. The Red Captain is a tool, nothing more, a name that keeps the scheme running and the profits flowing." "You're a murderer," Cross said, his voice hoarse. "I'm an accountant," Pemberton corrected. "I balance books. And when someone threatens the balance, like those Spanish captains who grew greedy, who wanted a larger cut, I restore order. You've been quite useful, actually. The Resolution's disappearance will be blamed on the Red Captain, adding to the legend. Your crew's deaths will discourage others from investigating too closely." "And Marsh?" Cross asked, stalling, searching for any opening. Marsh was an actor, hired in Port Royal for a few silver pieces. He's probably drunk in a tavern right now, celebrating his performance. Cross felt the weight of betrayal, the realization that he had been played from the beginning, that every action had been anticipated. But beneath the despair, a kernel of rage began to burn. Pemberton gestured to his raiders. "Finish them. Sink the ship. Make it look like a fight." The raiders advanced. Cross raised his cutlass, knowing it was futile but unwilling to die passively. Price stood beside him, breathing hard, blood running down his face. A dozen of Cross's crew still lived, clustered behind them, weapons raised in defiance. But before the raiders could strike, a sound split the night. A cannon shot, echoing across the water from the open sea. Then another. Pemberton spun toward the sound, his confidence fracturing. From the darkness beyond the quay emerged a ship, a sleek brigantine flying no flag, its gun ports open and smoking. Another cannon roared, and a ball smashed through the Resolution's rail, showering splinters. The new ship was not firing at Cross. It was firing at Pemberton's raiders. Confusion erupted. Pemberton's men turned toward the new threat, their formation breaking. The brigantine swung alongside the Resolution, and from its deck poured armed sailors, but these wore no masks, no crimson coats. They moved with the practiced violence of men who had killed before and would kill again. Cross seized the moment. He lunged forward and drove his cutlass through the nearest raider's chest. Price followed, his blade taking another. The deck became a three-way battle. Cross's crew, Pemberton's raiders, and the new arrivals, all fighting in the firelit darkness, while cannon smoke drifted across the water. Cross fought his way toward Pemberton, driven by fury and the desire for answers. But Pemberton was already retreating, scrambling over the rail into a longboat where several of his raiders waited. They pushed off and rowed toward the shore, abandoning their comrades. The new attackers made no move to pursue. Instead, their leader, a tall woman with grey-streaked hair and a scar across her jaw, called for her crew to secure the Resolution. Within minutes, the fighting ended. Pemberton's raiders, who remained alive, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Cross's crew, bloodied and stunned, could only watch as the woman approached. "Captain Cross," she said, her voice carrying a French accent. "My name is Marguerite Lacroix. I command the Vesper, and I've been hunting the false Red Captain for 6 months." Cross lowered his cutlass, breathing hard. "You're not with Pemberton? I'm a privateer, licensed by the French Crown. But more importantly, I'm a businesswoman who dislikes competition, and I especially dislike men who destroy ships under my namesake." "Your namesake?" Cross said, the pieces falling together. "You're the real Red Captain." Lacroix smiled, though it held no warmth. "I was. 10 years ago. I raided Spanish treasure fleets from Vera Cruz to Portobello, but I retired 5 years back, took my fortune, and settled in Martinique. Then 2 years ago, someone started using my name, burning ships in my old hunting grounds, destroying the reputation I'd built. I don't tolerate theft, Captain, especially not of my legend." She gestured to the shore, where Pemberton's bonfire still burned. "That man and his associates have been running their scheme for 18 months, using my name to frighten merchants and mask their corruption. They've made a mockery of everything I was." "You were a butcher," Cross said quietly. "I was honest," Lacroix corrected. "When I took a ship, my crew and I fought face to face. We gave quarter to those who surrendered. We never disguised our actions as accidents or divine punishment. Pemberton and his network are cowards who kill from shadows and blame phantoms. I won't have my name attached to that." She turned to her crew. "Search the Resolution. Find whatever documents Cross recovered. We'll need evidence to bring before the colonial governors, the ones not already compromised." Over the next hours, as dawn approached, Cross's surviving crew and Lacroix's privateers worked together to secure both ships and tend the wounded. Cross learned that Lacroix had been tracking the false Red Captain's pattern, had guessed Pemberton's plan to lure and eliminate investigating naval officers, and had followed the Resolution from Port Royal. "Pemberton will vanish," Lacroix said, as they stood together watching the eastern sky lighten. "Men like him always have escape routes, but his network is exposed now. The documents you found will implicate governors in Jamaica, Havana, and Santo Domingo. There will be trials, executions, reorganizations. The scheme is finished." "And you?" Cross asked. "What happens to the real Red Captain?" Lacroix looked at him, her scarred face unreadable. "I returned to Martinique and my vineyard. My fighting days ended long ago, Captain. I came out of retirement for one purpose, to reclaim what was mine or destroy it if reclamation proved impossible." She paused. "The Red Captain dies today. Let Pemberton take that name to whatever hole he crawls into. I'm done with it." She extended her hand. Cross hesitated, then shook it. "What should I tell the Admiralty?" "Tell them the truth, that the Red Captain was a criminal conspiracy, not a lone pirate. Tell them you destroyed the network with assistance from a French privateer who wishes to remain anonymous. They'll accept that. They want the problem solved, not complicated by embarrassing truths about one of their former hunters." The Vesper departed at mid-morning, sailing northeast toward the Windward Passage, leaving Cross and his diminished crew to repair the Resolution and sail her back to Port Royal. The voyage took 5 days. During that time, Cross read through the recovered documents again and again, tracing the connections between merchants, officials, and Pemberton's organization. The scale of the corruption stunned him. Dozens of men in positions of authority siphoning wealth from the colonial system while blaming an invented boogeyman. Port Royal received Cross as a hero, though the reception felt hollow. He presented his evidence to the governor, who immediately ordered arrests. Within a week, 3 senior customs officials and a naval captain had been taken into custody. Pemberton was never found. Rumor placed him in the Bahamas or Cartagena or aboard a ship bound for the American colonies. Stories that spread and transformed until no one remembered the plain bureaucrat, only the legend of the Red Captain who had vanished into myth. Cross resigned his commission 2 months later. He could not serve a system so thoroughly compromised, could not trust that the corruption had been fully excised. He took his accumulated pay and sailed north to the Carolinas, where he purchased land and built a small house overlooking a quiet river far from the sea. But on nights when wind moved through the pines and he heard distant sounds that might have been waves against a hull, Cross remembered the crimson coat silhouetted against flames, the feel of combat on a bloodied deck, and the conversation with a woman who had been the monster others pretended to be. Years later, when Cross was old and his hands trembled too much to hold a pistol steady, a letter arrived at his river house. It bore no return address, but the wax seal showed a faint red thumbprint. Inside, written in elegant script, was a single paragraph. Captain Cross, I read of your quiet life in the Carolinas and am pleased. Some men are suited for the Caribbean's violence, and some for its departure. I remained suited for neither and returned to France last spring, where I tend gardens and bore my grandchildren with old stories they half believe. The Red Captain is dead, as we agreed, though I suspect the name will surface again someday, worn by some ambitious fool seeking legend. Let them have it. We know the truth, that cities burned and ships vanished because men chose greed over honor, and we were merely the ones who tallied the cost. Your former ally in pretended villainy, Monsieur Lacroix. Cross burned the letter after reading it, watching the paper curl and blacken in his fireplace. But he kept the wax seal, pressing it into a leather-bound journal where he had begun recording his years at sea, the cases he had solved, and the criminals he had pursued. On the page opposite the red thumbprint, he wrote a final entry. The Red Captain's crew knew the truth, that monsters are made by those who profit from fear, and legends are weapons wielded by whoever can claim them first. The real evil was not a figure in a crimson coat, but the network of respectable men who used that figure to mask their theft. Pemberton and his associates stole more than cargo. They stole the meaning of justice itself, turning naval pursuit into theater and investigation into farce. That the true Red Captain helped expose this remains ironic and troubling. Perhaps redemption comes not from abandoning one's nature, but from choosing when and why to unleash it. The journal survived Cross's death and passed through several hands before finding its way to a maritime museum in Charleston. There, among collections of ship models and navigation instruments, it rests in a climate-controlled case, its pages yellowed but legible. Visitors who examine it closely can still see the red thumbprint pressed into the wax, can read Cross's account of corruption and conspiracy, and wonder which parts were truth and which were embellishment. But in taverns throughout the Caribbean, where sailors still gather to trade stories over rum, the name remains. The Red Captain, who burned cities and vanished ships, whose crew knew secrets that died with them, whose true face was never seen. The legend persists precisely because it was never fully destroyed, only transformed, passed from one generation to the next, adapted to fit whatever fears or fascinations drive the telling. Some stories refuse to end because their power lies not in resolution but in mystery. The Red Captain became such a story, existing in the gap between what happened and what was remembered, between documented corruption and folkloric villainy. And in that gap, the truth remains, that cities did burn, ships did vanish, and a crew did know why, though their knowledge died with them or transformed into something unrecognizable. Cross understood this as he grew old beside his Carolina River. He understood that he had been part of something larger than naval service, had participated in the death and birth of a legend, had stood at the threshold where history becomes mythology. And he understood that his role would eventually be forgotten, while the Red Captain's name would endure, not because the legend was true, but because it served a purpose that truth could not. The red wax seal remains in its leather journal, a fragment of evidence preserved against the erosion of time and memory. Museum visitors who notice it often ask the docents what it signifies. The docents, trained in historical accuracy, explain that it was a theatrical flourish used by Caribbean criminals in the early 18th century, a way of claiming responsibility for actions they may or may not have committed. A tool of fear, they say, nothing more. They do not mention that the thumbprint's ridges are clearly visible under magnification, unique and identifiable. They do not mention that identical prints appear on documents from 3 continents, spanning 20 years. They do not mention that maritime records show unexplained ship disappearances continued sporadically until 1749, each accompanied by reports of a figure in red, because some truths complicate the narrative, and some legends need to remain simple to survive.